The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Montana Territory as Catherine Reed clutched her 3-month-old daughter closer to her chest, trying to shield the infant from the bitter wind that cut through her thin shawl like a blade. It was December 1883, and the world seemed determined to freeze every living thing within its grasp. Behind her, the wagon that had carried them this far creaked and groaned as the driver prepared to turn back toward town, unwilling to venture further into the wilderness. "This is as far as I go." "Ma'am," the grizzled teamster called down from his perch. "Ain't safe to travel these mountain roads in weather like this." Catherine nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed against being left alone in this desolate place with nothing but a crying baby and the clothes on her back. She had no choice but to accept whatever shelter she could find, even if it meant throwing herself on the mercy of strangers. Her husband, Thomas Reed, had abandoned them just 3 weeks after little Mary was born, claiming he couldn't stand the sound of a crying child and that he'd never wanted the responsibility of fatherhood anyway. He'd taken what little money they had and disappeared into the night, leaving Catherine with nothing but debts and the crushing weight of trying to survive alone with a newborn in a world that showed little mercy to women. Without men to protect them, "There's a ranch about a quarter-mile up that road," the driver said, pointing through the swirling snow toward a barely visible track. "Belongs to a fellow named Jacob Brennan. Strange sort. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a reputation for being fair and honest. Might take you in until this storm passes." Catherine gathered what little courage she had left and began walking toward the distant glow of lamplight that marked civilization in this frozen wasteland. Mary whimpered against her chest, the baby's cries growing weaker as the cold sapped her strength. The sound that had driven Thomas away now seemed pitifully fragile, and Catherine found herself murmuring soothing words that were swallowed by the wind. The ranch house, when she finally reached it, was a substantial log structure that spoke of permanence and careful planning. Smoke rose from the stone chimney and warm yellow light spilled from the windows onto the snow-covered porch. It looked like something from a dream after the nightmare of the past few weeks. Catherine hesitated at the front door, aware of how she must look. A young woman in a tattered dress, holding a crying baby, appearing out of a blizzard like some desperate specter. But Mary's cries were growing more urgent, and the cold was becoming unbearable. She raised her hand and knocked. The door opened to reveal a man unlike any she had encountered before. Jacob Brennan stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that showed the first touches of silver at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of a life spent outdoors, but his dark brown eyes held a gentleness that surprised her. He wore simple clothes, wool trousers, and a thick sweater that emphasized his powerful build, but it was his stillness that struck her most. He had the quality of someone completely comfortable with silence. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Jacob's gaze took in Catherine's bedraggled appearance, the crying baby in her arms, and the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and quiet, with the faint trace of an accent that suggested he had been born far from this mountain wilderness. "Come inside," he said simply, stepping back to allow her entry. "You're freezing." The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, furnished with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and simple but beautiful artwork. Everything spoke of a man who valued quality and permanence, who had built something lasting in this harsh land. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "I'll make coffee." Catherine sank into the offered chair, finally allowing herself to believe that she and Mary were safe, at least for the moment. The baby's cries had subsided somewhat in the warmth of the house, but she was still fussy and uncomfortable in the way that only exhausted, hungry infants could be. Jacob returned with a steaming mug of coffee and a plate of bread and cheese, setting them on the small table beside her chair. He moved with economic grace, wasting no motion, and Catherine found herself studying his profile as he built up the fire to combat the cold that had followed them inside. "Thank you," Catherine said, cradling the warm mug in her hands. I'm Catherine Reed, and this is my daughter, Mary. I'm sorry to impose on you like this, but the storm caught us, and we had nowhere else to go." Jacob nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "Jacob Brennan," he said by way of introduction. "You're welcome here as long as you need to stay." The simple offer, given without questions or conditions, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "Mr. Brennan, I should be honest with you about my circumstances. I have very little money and nowhere to go once the storm passes. My husband left us, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do." Jacob listened to this confession without change of expression, his dark eyes steady and calm. "Where were you headed?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Catherine admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I thought perhaps I could find work in one of the mining towns, or maybe as a governess somewhere. I can read and write, and I know basic arithmetic. I'm not afraid of hard work. Mining towns are no place for a woman alone with a baby," Jacob said matter-of-factly. "And winter makes travel dangerous even for experienced men." Mary chose that moment to begin crying again, the thin wailing sound that had become the soundtrack to Catherine's existence. She shifted the baby, trying to comfort her, but nothing seemed to help. The child was hungry, tired, and overwhelmed by the changes in her short life. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, raising her voice over the crying. "She's been like this since her father left. I think she senses that something's wrong." Jacob stood and approached them slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands toward the baby. Catherine hesitated for just a moment before placing Mary in his arms. To her amazement, the man who seemed so stern and reserved handled the infant with practiced ease, supporting her head and holding her against his shoulder with confident movements. "There now, little one," Jacob murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind outside. "You're safe now. No need for all that crying." As if responding to the calm certainty in his voice, Mary's cries began to subside. Within minutes, she was quiet, nestled against Jacob's broad shoulder, with the trust that only babies and small animals seemed to possess in abundance. Catherine stared in amazement. "How did you do that?" "I've been trying to calm her for days." "Children sense fear and uncertainty," Jacob said quietly, still holding Mary with gentle competence. She needed to know that someone was completely unafraid and in control. "You have experience with babies," Catherine observed. A shadow passed across Jacob's face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Some," he said simply, then returned Mary to her mother's arms. The baby remained peaceful, finally able to rest in the warm security of the house. Over the next few days, as the blizzard raged outside and made travel impossible, Catherine began to understand the quiet rhythms of Jacob's life. He rose before dawn to tend to his small herd of cattle and the handful of horses he kept, worked steadily throughout the day maintaining his property and equipment, and spent his evenings reading by the fire or working on small woodworking projects with the patience of someone who had learned to find satisfaction in solitary pursuits. He was a man of few words, but those words were always thoughtful and kind. He shared his meals with Catherine and Mary without comment, gave up his own bedroom so Catherine could have privacy while nursing the baby, and seemed genuinely pleased by the presence of other human beings in his carefully ordered world. "Have you lived here long?" Catherine asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Mary sleeping peacefully in her lap. 8 years, Jacob replied, looking up from the wooden toy he was carving. "I came here after the war, looking for somewhere quiet to rebuild my life." "The war," Catherine repeated softly. "Were you a soldier?" Jacob nodded, his hands never pausing in their work. "Union Army. Saw more death and destruction than any man should have to see. When it was over, I wanted nothing more than peace and the chance to create something beautiful instead of destroying it." Catherine studied his profile in the firelight, seeing in the lines of his face the mark of someone who had indeed seen too much suffering. "Is that why you live alone out here?" "Partly," Jacob said, testing the smoothness of the toy horse he was creating. I'm not much for conversation or social gatherings. I find that I'm more comfortable with animals and growing things than I am with most people. But you've been so kind to Mary and me, Catherine said. You don't seem uncomfortable at all. Jacob looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. You're different, he said simply. You and the baby, you're not demanding anything from me except basic human decency. You're just grateful to be safe and warm. We are grateful, Catherine said softly. More grateful than you could know. The toy horse was taking shape under Jacob's skilled hands, its form emerging from the wood as if it had always been there, waiting to be revealed. Catherine watched him work, mesmerized by the careful attention he paid to every detail. Who is that for? She asked. Mary, Jacob said as if it were obvious. Every child should have a toy to play with. The casual assumption that Mary would be around long enough to need toys made Catherine's heart clench with a mixture of hope and fear. She had been trying not to think about what would happen when the storm ended, and she would have to leave this haven of peace and safety. Jacob, she began hesitantly. When the weather clears, I'll need to move on. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely. Jacob's hands stilled on the wood carving, and when he looked up at her, his expression was serious. Where will you go? I don't know, Catherine admitted. I suppose I'll try to find work in the next town, or maybe see if any of the ranches need domestic help. Traveling alone with a baby in winter, Jacob said quietly. You know how dangerous that would be. I know, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can't stay here forever. You have your own life to live. Jacob set down the carving and leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes intense. What if I told you that you could stay as long as you wanted? Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. Jacob, I couldn't ask you to do that. You barely know us. I know enough, he said firmly. I know that you're a good mother who's been dealt a terrible hand by life. I know that Mary is an innocent child who deserves to grow up safe and loved. And I know that this house has been empty too long. But what would people say a single woman living with a bachelor? There would be talk. Then we'll give them something different to talk about, Jacob said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, simple gold band. Marry me, Catherine. Not for romance or passion, but for practical reasons that benefit us both. You and Mary need protection and security. I need family. Catherine stared at the ring, her mind reeling. Jacob, you can't mean that. You don't love me. We barely know each other. I know you well enough to know that you're kind, intelligent, and strong, Jacob said steadily. I know you're a good mother and that you're not afraid of hard work. I know you don't complain when things are difficult, and you're grateful for simple kindnesses. He paused, looking down at the sleeping baby in her arms. As for love, maybe that's something that can grow between us over time. But right now, you need someone to take care of you and Mary, and I need to feel like my life has purpose again. Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes. What about Mary? What about the fact that she's not your child? She will be, Jacob said with quiet conviction. If you'll have me, she'll carry my name and be my daughter in every way that matters. No one will ever be able to say she's anything less than a cherished member of this family. The offer was so generous, so completely unexpected that Catherine could barely process it. Here was a man she had known for less than a week, offering to marry her and claim another man's child as his own, asking for nothing in return but the chance to have a family. Why? She whispered. Why would you do something so generous for strangers? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and filled with old pain. I had a family once, he said, a wife and a son. They died of fever while I was away fighting in the war. I came home to an empty house and graves I had never seen. I thought I would never want to open my heart to that kind of loss again. He looked up at her, and Catherine saw in his eyes a depth of sorrow that explained so much about his solitary life. But watching you with Mary these past few days, Jacob continued, seeing how much love you have for her, how hard you're fighting to give her a good life. It's reminded me that love is worth the risk of loss. And maybe Maybe God brought you both here for a reason." Catherine looked down at Mary, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Jacob's earnest face. In this quiet man, she sensed a strength and stability that Thomas had never possessed, a commitment to responsibility that went far deeper than mere obligation. "You would really claim Mary as your own?" she asked. "Give her your name. Treat her as if she were your birth daughter." "I would be honored to call her my daughter," Jacob said simply. "She deserves a father who will never abandon her, never make her feel unwanted. I can promise you both that, if nothing else." Catherine felt a tear slip down her cheek. "And you wouldn't expect—" "That is, you wouldn't require—" "I would expect nothing from you except what you're willing to give," Jacob said gently. "This would be a marriage of partnership and mutual support, not obligation. Anything beyond that would have to grow naturally, if it grows at all." The kindness in his voice, the respect he showed for her autonomy and dignity, sealed her decision. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I'll marry you. And I promise you won't regret giving us your name and protection." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be making his rounds despite the winter weather. The ceremony was simple, conducted in Jacob's front parlor with only the preacher's wife as witness. But Catherine had never felt more secure or hopeful about the future. Jacob slipped the simple gold band onto her finger with gentle hands, and when he spoke his vows, promising to love and protect both her and Mary, Catherine believed every word. This was a man who kept his promises, who understood the value of commitment and family. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said with satisfaction. "Mr. Brennan, you may kiss your bride." Jacob leaned forward and brushed his lips gently against Catherine's cheek, a gesture of respect rather than passion, but she felt the sincerity behind it. In his dark eyes, she saw not romantic love, but something perhaps more valuable, genuine care and the promise of unwavering support. Mary, now Mary Brennan, slept peacefully through the entire ceremony, as if she understood instinctively that she was finally safe. The months that followed established patterns that would define their marriage for years to come. Jacob proved to be a man of his word in every respect, treating Mary with the gentle devotion of a natural father and showing Catherine the kind of steady respect that allowed trust to flourish. He built a cradle for Mary with his own hands, carving intricate designs into the wood and padding it with the softest materials he could find. He sang to her in the evenings, his deep voice carrying half-remembered lullabies from his own childhood, and he walked the floor with her during sleepless nights without ever showing impatience or frustration. Catherine, for her part, found herself falling into the rhythms of ranch life with surprising ease. She managed the household with efficient grace, cooked meals that filled the house with wonderful aromas, and gradually began adding feminine touches that made the austere bachelor quarters feel like a true home. But more than the practical aspects of their partnership, something deeper was growing between them. Jacob's quiet strength provided Catherine with the security she had never known, while her presence and Mary's laughter brought warmth back into a heart that had been frozen by loss and loneliness. "She's walking," Catherine called out one spring morning as Mary took her first tentative steps across the kitchen floor. Jacob dropped the harness he was mending and hurried inside, just in time to see his daughter toddle toward him with arms outstretched. When she reached him, he swept her up in his arms, his face transformed by pure joy. "That's my girl," he said, spinning her around until she giggled with delight. "Walking already, just like her mama. Strong and determined." Catherine watched the interaction with a full heart, marveling at how completely Jacob had embraced fatherhood. Mary clearly adored him, reaching for him whenever he entered a room and settling contentedly in his arms in a way she had never done with Thomas. "She's lucky to have you for a father," Catherine said softly. "We're all lucky," Jacob replied, meeting her eyes over Mary's head. "I never thought I'd have a family again, and now I can't imagine life without either of you." The affection in his voice was unmistakable, and Catherine felt her own heart respond with warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with growing love. That evening, after Mary was asleep in her crib, Catherine found Jacob on the front porch, looking out at the stars that filled the clear mountain sky. She joined him, settling into the chair beside his that had become her customary place. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his expression attentive. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," she said simply. "Not just grateful, not just appreciative of your kindness, but truly, deeply in love. I wanted you to know, even if you don't feel the same way." Jacob was quiet for so long that Catherine began to wonder if she had made a mistake in being so honest. Then he reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with gentle warmth. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been in love with you since the night you first trusted me to hold Mary. I just didn't think. I had the right to hope you could feel the same way about a man who offered you marriage out of practical necessity. You offered me marriage out of kindness and generosity," Catherine corrected. "And you've spent every day since then showing me what real love looks like. Not the selfish, demanding kind that Thomas offered, but the kind that gives freely and protects fiercely. When Jacob kissed her this time, it was with the passion of a man who had found something he thought was lost forever." Catherine melted into his embrace, feeling complete for the first time in her adult life. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys, as all marriages do. There were harsh winters when the cattle struggled and money was tight. Beautiful summers when the ranch prospered and Mary grew strong and happy, and quiet seasons when the three of them simply enjoyed the peaceful life they had built together. Mary grew up believing Jacob was her natural father, and he was in every way that mattered. He taught her to ride and shoot, to read and write, and to understand that a person's worth was measured by their character rather than their circumstances. She never questioned why she looked different from him, accepting with the easy faith of childhood that families came in all configurations. Catherine and Jacob welcomed 2 more children over the years, a son they named Samuel and another daughter they called Grace. But Mary was never made to feel like anything less than the cherished eldest child, and the love that bound the family together grew stronger with each passing year. The story of how they came together became part of local legend. The desperate young mother who appeared out of a blizzard with a crying baby, and the silent rancher who took them in and gave them his name without asking for anything in return. It was a tale that spoke to the best impulses of human nature, the willingness to help strangers and the courage to open one's heart to unexpected love. But for Catherine and Jacob, it was simply the story of how they found each other when they needed each other most, and how they built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate disappointments. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where they had first confessed their love, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked, watching Mary play with her younger siblings in the yard. "You mean if Thomas hadn't left?" Jacob said, understanding immediately. Yes, if he had stayed, if he had been the father Mary deserved. Jacob shook his head firmly. "Then you would never have been mine. Mary would never have been mine. We would never have had this family, this life, this love." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes warm with affection and certainty. "I can't regret the path that brought you to me, Catherine. Even if it involved pain and hardship, it led to something more beautiful than anything I could have imagined." Catherine smiled, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their children play in the golden evening light. "Sometimes I think Mary's crying that first night wasn't really about being hungry or cold. I think she was calling for you, calling for the father she was meant to have." "Maybe she was," Jacob said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And maybe the silence I found in these mountains was really just me waiting for the sound of my family coming home." In the distance, Mary's laughter rang out clear and joyful, a sound that had replaced the desperate crying of that long-ago winter night. She was happy, secure, and loved by a man who had chosen to be her father when her biological father had chosen to walk away. And in that laughter, Catherine heard the echo of all the choices that had led them to this moment. her choice to keep fighting for her daughter's future, Jakob's choice to open his heart again despite the risk of loss, and their shared choice to build a family based on love rather than obligation. They had proven that sometimes the most beautiful families are not born but chosen, and that the deepest love often grows not from passion, but from the daily decision to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. If this story of second chances, chosen family, and love that grows from kindness rather than convenience touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to be reminded that our greatest blessings often come disguised as our darkest challenges. Your support helps these stories reach others who may be walking through difficult seasons, showing them that sometimes when one door closes, another opens to reveal something more beautiful than we ever dared to hope for. Thank you for believing in the transformative power of love that chooses to see beyond circumstances to the precious worth of every human heart.